In most of the Devil in Me's endings, Hector Monday gets killed, either when his boat crashes into a rock or a propeller dices him up like his victims. Despite this, someone arrives and, while wearing Dumay's famous rubber gloves, picks up Hector's mask and opens the doors of the second murder hotel. Which brings us to an important question. Who is this? There are a few possibilities which sound good, but likely aren't accurate. Let's go over them before we dig into what was really happening during the Architects of Murder crew's trip to the island motel. Theory number 1. Hector survived the boat crash, because he's supernatural in some way, that he did, in fact, have the devil in him. An understandable theory, slashers of Hector's ilk have preternatural survival abilities in fiction, so is it really so strange that Supermassive would offer that kind of a killer here? Maybe not, but two things fly in the face of that theory. One, the developers have been extremely clear about their insistence that, other than the curator, there are no other supernatural elements in the game. Yes, there are vampires and aliens, but both are depicted as regular biological entities that just happen to be from outer space. Debatably, there's one real ghost in Little Hope, but she only shows up to save Anthony in a very specific ending. 2. This scene of the curator striking out Hector's name makes it clear that he is in fact dead. It does not happen if the players get the ultimatum ending and Hector survives. Theory 2. It's the curator. As fun as this theory is, there's no real evidence to support it. While the curator's involvement in The Devil in Me is more significant than previous games in the series, he's not actually participating in the murders. As for the nature of his role in the game, that's going to have to wait for another video. And finally, theory number 3, and this is the one that's true, Granthem Dumay was actually two people the whole time. What evidence is there that this is the case? A surprisingly large amount. The first and most obvious being the piece of paper that the curator is writing on. The implication is clear. Hector Monday is dead, but Granthem Dumay is still around. Second is the reference to duality throughout the entire game. The main collectibles are obols with two sides. Both Dumay and Charlie are fixated on their business cards. There are numerous traps featuring two people, only one of whom survives. The curator starts the game standing in front of a mirror, creating a double effect. This newspaper prominently features the word Gemini, which is the twin constellation. The huge amount of money mentioned in the mask email suggests that he was buying more than one of them. While all the handwriting we see is Hector's, this note, which is available in the curator's cut, is very suggestive. It's not in the same handwriting as everything else in the hotel. Then there's the psychological aspect. Granthem Dumay's serial killer MO makes no sense whatsoever. On one hand, you have a murderous conman who spent millions of dollars to recreate the Holmes murder hotel, killing people using elaborate traps. Then you also have a guy who's obsessed with body preservation and mannequins, creating elaborate animatronics using a combination of real humans and mechanical parts. These MOs have nothing to do with one another because they're not one person. There's a guy with no core personality who decided to reinvent himself as H.H. Holmes, and you have a weirdo who's obsessed with making human dolls. As long as you're willing to accept that both men are the same race and build and that the developers are using one model to represent both men for convenience's sake, we can start examining the timelines, and once we do, it will be impossible to avoid the conclusion that there must be two killers on the island. Let's take a look at the timeline of the team's arrival. They get there at 4:56 p.m. and as the limo dries up, there's clearly someone manually controlling the security cameras. Since we know that Dumay is the one driving the car, who's operating them? From here on, for clarity's sake, I'll refer to them as Hector and Dollmaker. For example, the way he takes an extra string off the cuff of his sleeve and tosses it aside suggests that the Dollmaker doing this, while Hector is managing things on the island, getting Morello ready to come out and operate the ferry. When they arrive on the island at 6:12, Dollmaker is in the control room monitoring the guests while Hector is outside, dressed as the groundskeeper, moving the luggage and checking on the various gates and locks, keeping the guests trapped on the island. When he's finished moving the equipment, Hector heads to the other side of the island to check in with his mother's corpse. This is happening somewhere around 7 p.m. At 7:09 p.m., Aaron sees Tom and Bethany Morello. The Dollmaker has just released Bethany from some kind of secret room and she runs to her father in what looks like a closet. The two immediately flee the hotel, taking 9 minutes to run down to the dock. Jamie sees them turn on the ferry and leave the island. As she's watching them, the Dollmaker is standing behind the mirror in her room, watching her drink a bottle of wine. Hector has presumably walked down from the lighthouse he shares with his mother's corpse, gotten into the boat, and motored to the other shore so that he can be waiting for the Morellos when they get to the other side that they assume is safe. At this point, you might ask, couldn't the one you're calling Dollmaker have just run down from the hotel, recalled the ferry, and then shot them from the dock after recalling the ferry, the way he does in the Ultimatum bad ending? The answer, of course, is no. Jamie is in a room overlooking the dock, so there's a chance she'll see and hear the shots. Let's not forget, it's been established that it takes around 8 minutes to sprint down to the dock from the second floor of the hotel, and Dollmaker would have to start this sprint after they'd already left because he was watching Jamie a full 30 seconds after the ferry starts moving. By the time he got down to the dock, the ferry would have already made it to the other side. More importantly, we know he doesn't do this because between Jamie seeing the ferry leaving at 7:19 and the next scene starting at 7:29, we see the Dollmaker head to the basement and start working on the Kate mannequin for the dinner scene. There's literally no time for him to have dealt with the Morellos. So when did this happen? When the Morellos arrived on the other side of the lake, around say 7:25, Hector was waiting for them. He stabbed them both to death, loaded them back onto his boat, set the ferry to return, and then motored back to the island. At the same time as the Morellos' corpses are being moved onto the dock, the Dollmaker puts on a groundskeeper's raincoat and heads outside to grab something, where he's noticed by Mark as he explores the library. Then he heads into the bar and briefly looms behind Charlie before heading down to the basement to set up the fire diversion trap that Mark will take part in. For the next few hours, we don't see enough of Dumais to know whether we're looking at Hector or the Dollmaker. For example, we can't say which of them can stab Aaron in the dark room, but considering the amount of time it would take to surgically remove most of the organs in Aaron's chest cavity, wire up her heart to keep beating, and install a speaker in her mouth, it's fair to say that in the event that Aaron gets stabbed, the Dollmaker was busy doing that for almost the entire time Hector was following the team around the spa and setting Charlie on fire. Also, when they've trapped Dumais, likely Hector, briefly on the 3rd floor, we can see there's an extra hat hanging on the hat rack. Presumably this means the Dollmaker is walking around somewhere at this point without his hat on. There's actually evidence that Jamie just misses seeing both Dumais together. When she looks through the mirror, she sees the door swinging closed. Based on the speed at which it was closing, it was open and someone walked through it just seconds earlier. Then Dumais walks past the camera from the right. There wasn't enough time for him to get into position from the door when she arrives at the mirror. So if he'd been able to walk through that door, she'd have seen him in the room. She doesn't, so someone else was using that door while Hector was at the other end of the room, to the right of the mirror. The most crucial scene for proving this theory happens a little earlier when Jamie opens a mirror and winds up in a viewing room. There she sees live footage of Mark walking into the Dollmaker's workshop. Having just played this scene, the player knows that 10 seconds after the footage we see in Jamie's chapter happens, Mark either hides under the table while the Dollmaker preps a mannequin, or gets drugged and dragged off. How can we tell that it isn't Hector? Because the moment Jamie walks into the next hallway, she discovers that Hector is hanging out in the interrogation room, reliving one of his conversations with Manny Sherman. The game couldn't be clearer about this. At the exact same time, we can see 2 different Dumais in locations clearly associated with their unique histories and personality traits. The detective is in his interrogation room while the Dollmaker is in his workshop, and the game is explicit about these sequences happening simultaneously. This is proof positive that there are 2 Dumais. So if Granthem Dumais really is 2 different people sharing a role and one of them is Hector Monday, who's the other one? We don't actually have to speculate here because the game flat out tells us who it is. If the lighthouse is the most Hector part of the island, it's where his friends, the Edwards family, lived, and where he's made a home taking care of his long-dead mother, then the most Dollmaker part of the island is the curing house, where corpses are taken and preserved so that they can be used to make animatronics. When visiting this location, Mark and Charlie can find a newspaper dated 1993. The headline tells of the story of Hector Monday investigating the so-called imaginary killer. The killer's MO? He kills people, preserves their bodies, then cuts them to pieces and reassembles them into animatronics using mechanical parts. The imaginary killer has the exact same MO as the Dollmaker, half of the Dumais persona. The imaginary killer is Hector's partner, and he's kept a souvenir of the first time they entered one another's orbits. The kicker that solidifies this is the correct interpretation? Remember how I said one of the broad clues about 2 killers was the word Gemini being featured on a newspaper? This is the newspaper that it's featured on. So now that we know that there are 2 Dumais, Hector and Dollmaker, how does this change the synopsis of the game's story? What really happened that the game left out? Let's jump back to winter at the end of 1997. Hector Monday is a mess, his mother is dying, he started killing people, and his own team is closing in on him. He needs a way out, and an interview with Manny Sherman has given him one. If he can turn himself into H.H. Holmes, he can do all the killing he wants without ever getting caught. But that won't solve the more pressing issue, his mother's mortality. He wants to figure out a way to keep her with him forever, but luckily he already knows someone who can help him with that, the imaginary killer, who we're going to keep calling the Dollmaker for clarity's sake. Years earlier, he failed to catch the Dollmaker, but now, armed with far more experience and the insight that comes from actually committing some serial killings himself, Hector finds the Dollmaker. Except instead of arresting him, he gives him an offer. They can become partners. Obviously, the dollmaker was likely skeptical of such a thing. How could this famous FBI agent not be trying to trick him? Hector then showed the dollmaker the proof of his claims, the teeth and ears he took from his first 2 victims. The proposal is simple. Hector will provide him with an endless stream of victims for his hobbies, and all he has to do is help maintain and run the hotel, and find a way to keep Hector's mother from disappearing forever from his life. The dollmaker clearly agrees to these terms, and they seal the deal by combining their MMOs. The dollmaker installs the teeth and ears from Hector's victims onto one of his mannequins, and the partnership is formed. Following the dollmaker's suggestion, Hector starts recording audio that he can use as his mother's voice in the animatronic, and once she dies, the dollmaker immediately digs her up and begins preserving the body. It's likely to assume that he assists Hector in faking his own death. It wouldn't be a surprise to discover that the dollmaker was some sort of medical professional before turning to mass murder, and the 2 men start living out their lives as Granthem Dumais. As Hector befriends the Matthews and patiently awaits their deaths, the dollmaker sets up shop in the recently abandoned lighthouse on the shore. There he keeps in practice, catching animals and transforming them into preserved animatronics. He likely also had a say in the hotel's design. The suffocation chamber was almost certainly included at his insistence. Probably preserving corpses requires the bodies to be relatively intact at death, and there's no cleaner way of killing someone on the island than the vacuum rooms. While Hector seems to relish brutally stabbing, chopping, and even shooting his victims, the dollmaker wants bodies that he can use, which is why there's always at least 2 people placed in the suffocation chamber with someone forced to choose. The way there's always at least 1 corpse for the dollmaker's purposes in each set of 5 victims. So what happened at the end of the game? Simple. When things started to go sideways and Hector was chasing people around the island with an axe, the dollmaker took the ferry to the other side of the island to lie in wait, just in case they made it across. Then when he saw a boat explosion on the lake, he knew something had gone horribly awry and went looking around for any sign that Hector had survived. All he wound up recovering was Hector's broken mask. So while the authorities searched the island and discovered the house of horrors the 2 had been building there, the dollmaker travels to their backup hotel that they've been building while committing the island murders, and got right back to work. Will he be able to keep things going without a partner like Hector? Probably not, but it won't stop him from trying.
Hidden Object Guru here. Thanks for watching the video, and now, since you've made it to the end, maybe consider liking and subscribing, both here and to Unabridged's channel, where he covers all of the hidden gems you can handle. Also, be sure to check out my new game, Dracula Defense, on Steam. It's the only tower defense game where you can defend Dracula. See you back here for more Dark Pictures content, but until then, au revoir.